let's see, we should be able to bring people in. Oh.
It's quite weird just sitting watching the numbers go up. At what point do we say that's it, we start?
Okay. At least the numbers are going up.
Oh, we haven't said anything yet. I mean, much as they went down now. Oh my God, we're on, all these women, we're on the wrong webinar.
Well, they've slowed down, so I suggest we start. I mean, there's one or two still coming, but as soon as I say that, they pick up again.
Oh, we're at 40.
And it's 657 and counting.
Then we win.
We've got about 120 signed up. So let's see.
Yeah, but that always reduces by a huge proportion.
Absolutely. Okay, just
one more minute, because nobody ever comes on time.
Yes.
And I thought that was one of the things about Zoom calls that they did, unlike when you're wandering off a tube or whatever.
Yeah, that's true. Well, I don't know. It's usually, the usual thing for me is I'm always late. That's because I can never get the bloody link to work.
Yeah, there are some issues, definitely.
How many are we at now? 42. For those of you who are here, before we start, if you want to put in the chat, hi, how, where you are, and any affiliation you've got or not, just so we have a rough idea who's actually joined. We will have a list, but it's always nice to have a little bit of an icebreaker so that people can see who's there. Ah, hi, Leslie. Margaret. Oh yeah, these are all people known. It's like a family reunion. Angelica, hi. This is great. We have a truly international grouping, I think.
Amazing people.
Well, before we get distracted by doing all that, I suppose we ought to start really. I will start by welcoming everybody and thank people for coming to this webinar, which we have entitled Can the Security Council Save Ukraine and Save Itself, which is extraordinarily loaded, partly because the word save is indicative of an imminent catastrophe and an ending, which is not usually well. Ukraine is experiencing that catastrophe, but we could as easily insert for Ukraine, Palestine, Yemen, Syria, Myanmar, Afghanistan, DRC, many, many more who are experiencing that catastrophe. And then we are going to discuss whether, in fact, the real question is what happened to the maintenance of international peace and security as promised by the UN Charter and supposedly to be enacted by the Security Council. In order to discuss that, we're going to have a discussion as to what happened to the Security Council, what happened to the never again promises from the UN Charter. And we will discuss. And the discussion is going to be between myself, Madeleine Rees. I'm the Secretary General of the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom, founded in 1915 and the oldest women's peace organization in the world, founded to identify the root causes of conflict, which the two most prominent are inequalities between people and between nations, and militarism as a way of thought. And those are the two that I think are most pertinent in today's world. Yeah, 107 years old. Don't worry, we have a long attention span, lots of patience, and we never give up. So we're still going to be here, still talking about peace when everybody else has given up. Joining me, I'm delighted to welcome fabulous gang that I love working with. Christine Chinkin, Professor Christine Chinkin, who I think anybody who's anything to do with feminist international law will know. And even those, not just feminists. I think Christine is one of the foremost of the international human rights and lawyers who has brought so much to the debate on international law, its interpretation, how to make it work in practice, done many cases on very pertinent topics. But a barrister at Matrix still, I don't so you don't do that anymore, do you? But is a barrister from Matrix. But now it's founded the Gender Centre at the London School of Economics. And fabulous to have you with us. I do nothing on international law unless I've made that phone call to Christine. Similarly brilliant, Louise Arimatsu, who is one of the foremost known lawyers on international humanitarian law, so well known, in fact, that poached by NATO at one point, which I think gave you an insight into how hackers work, if I recall. So anything you want to know about that, go to Louise. Also at the London School of Economics. And to discuss, to bring in the dimensions from the Ukrainian perspective, not least because of her background as as a feminist activist in Ukraine, and because recently she did an extremely useful, helpful analysis of the gender dimensions of the conflict with UN Women in Care. To bring that dimension into it, we have Oksana, who was also at the London School of Economics, a little bit of a Kirk. Our diversity is not really reaching out, is it really? Because I also have a slight affiliation with the London School of Economics. And we also have all of you who are part of the webinar, because we will have time at the end for Q&As. So first of all, I want us to start perhaps by interrogating the first element. Can the UN Security Council save itself? And in February, on behalf of WILPF, I wrote a letter to the Security Council, basically saying, what are you doing in the face of this imminent catastrophe? What is happening? Why are you not using the tools that are available to you in order to bring a peaceful solution to what was becoming a real threat to international peace and security? Not surprisingly, no notice was taken. And so several weeks ago, we then wrote another letter. And Christine, I would like to pass it to you at this moment in time, just to say, in those discussions, could you describe for people why we came to the argumentation we did and the context in which that arose? And you're muted.
Yeah, thank you, Madeleine, and thank you for your very generous introduction. I think you've already explained the context. I mean, the context is this growing frustration that where there are imminent catastrophes, to use your language, or crises emerging which clearly threaten international peace and security, we don't see action from the body that's been given the primary responsibility for the maintenance of international peace and security by the United Nations Charter, Article 24. And so that primary responsibility should be being exercised, and should be being exercised before the crisis reaches levels of humanitarian disaster, levels that we have seen in so many places, as you've mentioned. And I think it's this inaction that is causing frustration, and we'll come on to this later on, certainly among other members of the United Nations General Assembly and among civil society actors such as WILPF. And I think sort of two things we ought to emphasize right at the outset. The Security Council is the global body. It's the body with the legitimacy given by the Charter, by the states of the world, to act in situations of international peace and security. It's the only global body of that sort, but that with that primary responsibility comes accountability, and that bodies are justified in asking, why are you not acting? And I think the second important point to emphasize, you used the word tools. And too often, I think people assume that the only tool available to the Security Council is the tool of military intervention, mandating military intervention through calling upon states to provide forces, security forces, police forces, for a peace operation. But the Security Council's got other tools as well. It can investigate. It can emphasize the importance of peaceful settlement of disputes. Collective security carries with it the obligation to settle disputes peacefully, as well as the collective security system within the Security Council itself. It can call upon the Secretary General to act in various ways. There are a range of actions that it can undertake. And I think one of the things we might do today is think about what other actions might be possible to the Security Council. But I'll stop there for the moment.
No, thanks, Christine, because I think it was really important, because one of the reasons why we came to what can we do now is because there was a lot of discussion, because of the inaction of the UNSC, a lot of discussion as to the nature of the veto, the need for reform. And I think we were all saying, well, yeah, absolutely, those discussions have to be had, but we've got a burning crisis and many more crises. And so what can we do now? So Louise, you were party to those discussions. Your take on what could be going on?
Yeah, so I just want to re-emphasize everything that Christine has just laid out, and sort of these ideas, that were prompting us to have this conversation and then to go on and have this event, not only shared, as you say, amongst civil society activists, but also amongst states too. And we see this, over the years. I mean, most recent debate at the UN, it was, and I've got a quote here. The sentiment is captured, by the Turkish ambassador to UN, who says the Council has failed to carry out its mandate to maintain international peace and security on many occasions. And I went sort of through the recent situations, and the classic ones that are raised are Iraq, Syria, Georgia, Crimea, Gaza. But then we can go back in time and at looking at how the Security Council has failed to operate in many of these situations. Is partially to do with the veto. It's not completely about the veto, but the veto is problematic. But it's also about the composition of the Security Council. And times have changed. It was set up in 1945, and it is way past time when we begin to think about structural change for this institution to really be representative of the global community. I'm going to stop there to enable others to come in too.
Can I just add one further sentence, which of course it's not just the veto, it's the permanency. It's the permanent members of the council. The others rotate, and it's a hugely fought election every time membership of the Security Council is up. So that responsibility carries on to those other members as well. But the permanent members should carry greater responsibility.
Yeah, and so we're saying responsibility and accountability. And what we were arguing in that letter was there are legal grounds upon which they should act. I would, without going into the details of the letter, because we can make that available to people, but just to say what were the things that was being suggested they could and should be doing now in the imminent situation of catastrophe in Ukraine, and is that still relevant? We'll come to you in a minute, Oksana, to contribute to that particular question.
Can I jump in again, please?
Please do.
Madeleine. One of the things that we started talking about is, yes, we have the 5 permanent members, but we also have this rotation system. And I come back to the point Christine made, what is the responsibility? How do we understand the responsibility of being a member state of the Security Council, whether one is a permanent member or whether one is a temporary member? And can that be reflected in, what expectations we have and what obligations then come from those expectations and from those different, what I call sort of levels of responsibility, individually, but also collectively. Do member states of the Security Council, while they are on the Security Council, have responsibilities over and above simply as member states of the United Nations? And then how do you negotiate that fact? can you, are these responsibilities divisible? How might we reflect that in what those expectations and, as I said, obligations might be?
Is what we want in that respect, just sorry, it's what we want is for them to actually take responsibility for them. Now I'm a member of the Security Council. Now my mandate is for international peace and security. How do I apply that? And then what we said was, you've got to go on mission and understand the root causes and provide a solution based on an understanding of how international law must regulate that. And Christine, if could I just ask you then just to dive in and say a little bit more about what we were saying they should be looking at.
Sorry, before we come to that, can I just add something to what Louise has just said? We've talked about the responsibility of those states while they are on the Security Council and the over and above responsibility. But don't let's forget, they also have responsibilities as states. Just because they're on the Security Council doesn't mean they lose their everyday responsibilities that all states have as members of the international community. And those are obligations to respect and ensure human rights, for example, to respect international humanitarian law. And surely, at the very least, those words respect and ensure require states to call to account other states that are breaking or in clear violation. So that's just another side issue. So what we went back and said in the letter is particularly this notion of a fact-finding investigation or commission of inquiry. And I think another point that's important to remember is that while many other bodies set up fact-finding missions, Human Rights Council, for example, regional bodies of various sorts, it's only the Security Council that can make a decision to act, a decision under Chapter 7 of the United Nations Charter. And when the Security Council makes a decision, other member states under the Charter are required to act in accordance with that decision. In other words, the Security Council on a fact-finding mission or an investigatory mission can go into a territory and does not need the consent of that state to do so. Every other body that sets up a fact-finding mission has to seek consent of the state in question. And I think that's an enormously important legal point. Of course, there may be problems on the ground, but legally, that is extremely important. What should the Security Council have gone in to look at? There's been an enormous amount in Ukraine, but also in many other conflicts, of competing stories, competing accounts, information, misinformation. An objective mission by the body authorized to do that could do a great deal to say, here is an account of what is happening that the international community at large must stand by. So resolve inconsistent accounts of what is going on. Look further into root causes, examine what is going on, perhaps authorize human rights monitors, other bodies to maintain a vigilance as to what is actually happening. The value of having an objective body with a mandate in a particular area. Ceasefire, obviously. And a ceasefire that takes account of all aspects of what is going on there, including particular gender-based violence and associated actions. I think that was pretty well what we said in the letter, wasn't it? What have I left out, Madeleine?
No, pretty much what we said. I mean, there's a whole, unless I want to move on to Oksana, because Oksana, you were responsible for the drafting of the report for UN Women, as I mentioned. And we've done the theoretical overview. This is what the Security Council could do, and it has an authority which doesn't reside with individual politicians dashing up to Kiev for a photo opportunity with Zelensky, you know, and self-serving for their own political demands at home. It's the authority of the Security Council which could make a difference. I just want to throw in there as well, we also raised the issue that it's got to be an expanded fact-finding mission, because we also really need to look and examine at the implications for the grain harvests and how that impacts on other countries whose own peace and security will be affected as a result of food shortages. But to move back to you, Oksana, can you speak a little bit to the report that you did, what you were finding from the gender perspective, and how that would feed into, or if it could feed to and inform a mission from the Security Council, or is that just now a complete red herring from what should be happening?
Greetings, everyone. You can hear me. I can see my mic moving. I may surprise you by not focusing as much on the report as perhaps you would like me to, but I will definitely cover a little bit of what is in it. I was part of a team drafting it, to be honest, not the main responsible person, but had an honor of working with other colleagues on what is now 2 reports, progressive reports of rapid gender assessments of the humanitarian situation of Ukraine, covering mostly the humanitarian needs and the realities on the ground, not so much touching on aspects of women, peace and security and participation because of its focus. But before I go into it, I was reminded when I was preparing for this event of an email I received from Kvinna till Kvinna organization in mid-January this year, when I had just returned to Ukraine after completing my master's program and visiting my parents in the Donetsk region, Donbass region, 50 kilometers from contact line with the unrecognized republics, occupied territories. And in that email, the question was, we would like to receive your comments as a women's rights activist on whether you think that the invasion of Russia into Ukraine is possible, and if so, what can the international community do to prevent it and why? And it took me a couple of days to respond to it because I was in Donbass and I was in the area where people were reading the news and preparing for what may or may not happen. And my response was that we as feminist activists in Ukraine have been working with the aftermath of conflict in Donbass since 2014. And we have seen and experienced the humanitarian impacts of this conflict, including displacement, which is heavily gendered, including economic unsustainability of those who are displaced, including destruction of territories, violation of human rights on the occupied territories, and many other consequences. And we can anticipate that with any escalations, this crisis would only multiply tenfold, millionfold. And that was my main argument, imploring to international organizations, saying, if you know anything you can do in your powers to stop this from happening. At the time, it felt like it was just men shaking their arms to each other's faces and boasting about bringing military to the borders. And that was my main argument. And indeed, unfortunately, the humanitarian crisis has erupted, and the report does cover it in extensive detail, outlining the intersectionalities of vulnerabilities of women and men related to age, disability, the inability of people to leave the territories, even if they are under heavy shelling, due to high prices of rent and lack of shelters, lack of safe shelters. And apart from these immediate, obvious security needs, the increasing economic threats, such as job loss and lack of access to funding, and the type of financial assistance that the government is providing, which is not enough for people to sustain themselves. And the flows of humanitarian assistance that are coming in that often are not coordinated in terms of the needs on the ground and the work of local organizations who are doing a lot already. And just you're welcome to read a lot of this in the report itself. I will paste the links in the chat. But I wanted to clarify and to strengthen, actually, that came out for me as a feminist researcher in preparing this report and in preparing for this event, is that there seems to be a cross-cutting issue related to global power relations that is just so cross-cutting. While on the ground, we see that the international organizations come in without necessarily respecting and consulting the opinions of local organizations led by women most of the time. In the same way, on the larger scale, the countries and the societies that bear the biggest impact of wars have no say on the global security infrastructure. I mean, I think that's the core of the problem. It's not how we toss around the permanent members. Who are the permanent members? There's still global north, 5 global north countries. And one of those countries, I want to remind you, a piece of news that baffled me in April, that when it came out, France has been trading arms with Russia since 2014. selling worth of 150 million euros of arms, overcoming the embargo that was placed by the EU. Has Russia as a permanent Security Council member seen consequences for this? I'm not sure. I have not heard of it. So my question is not only to responsibility, but also to accountability for permanent members of the Security Council for lack of following their own commitments, and for what I would dare say, a call for decolonization almost of the UN structure, where we can no longer live in a society, in a system where those who make decisions about peace and security are mostly the countries that inflict conflict and war on others, but not those that bear its consequences. I also looked at it's quite easy to find actually, the list of vetoes that have been voted over the last, since the beginning actually of the work of the UN. And since 1990, predominantly the countries that have been using the power of veto are Russia and the US or USSR before 1990. But since 1990, those two countries have been the main ones that have used 90% of the veto. And since early 2000s, I think it was only Russia. What kind of multilateralism are we talking about if it's only two superpowers that are vetoing one thing against each other, and all the other five are chipping in here and there? And this to me shows how somehow we have failed to integrate power analysis in setting up and analyzing the effectiveness of the structure that is supposed to maintain peace and security. And this is where I think feminist minds and thoughts can bring this power analysis to innovate the Security Council or any other structure that we want to set up in the future. I have more points, but I will come back to them later.
No, I love those. Totally love those, because it's so right. Basically, we keep on talking as if there are ways in which we can influence what's happening, but then as you so rightly point out, where are we the people in this discussion? It's the P5, and they are the biggest arms traders. So excuse me, where's the vested interest in perpetuating conflict?
Sorry,
Please
Nadine,
do.
can I jump in here? Because
Absolutely.
so much of what Oksana has just said has resonated with some of the other work and some of the other sort of activities that I've been involved with other feminist activists working in conflict zones. And clearly it's Yemen that keeps on coming to mind, and it's the arms sales from this country, among others, on the P5, into that region that has just exacerbated the situation there. And it is, unfortunately, it really is, all about the money. It's follow the money every single time. And so we have a structural problem that, again, Oksana points to in terms of where the power lies in the international system, and the very fact that it resides with these 5 member states who are all nuclear weapon states and who are the states with the veto. And there is abuse going on. And this is the frustration that is driving the rest of the international community as well as civil society. And so it is time that we do look at the entire makeup and structure of the Security Council, but also to introduce reform in a manner that has some kind of a redistribution of power between, let's say, a Security Council entity plus the rest of the UN member states and General Assembly, because right now it just does not make any sense. I'm going to stop there because I'm sure others will want to jump in too.
Let's not go down the economic route, because we're going to have because it's so important. We're going to have a whole webinar on it. So follow the money and see what we can do to hold accountable those who are moving the money and actually enabling regimes like that of Putin. Christine, because we now said Security Council totally compromised in many of the things it should be doing, can you speak a little perhaps what the role of the General Assembly could be? Is there any way in through the General Assembly?
Well, of course, the General Assembly found a way in, or at least the United States encouraged the General Assembly to find a way in way back in 1950. at the time of the so-called Uniting for Peace resolution, which essentially said that when there was an emergency and that the Security Council was failing to act, then provided the General Assembly was acting within the purposes and principles of the Charter, the General Assembly could make recommendations. And under the Charter, Article 10 specifically says that the General Assembly may make recommendations with respect to international peace and security. And Article 12 starts off essentially saying that the General Assembly cannot do that if the Security Council is acting. Well, the whole point, of course, of what we're talking about is that the Security Council isn't acting. And that was the basis of Uniting for Peace. And Uniting for Peace has been used a few times, I think it's 11 times over the years since 1950. But I think to jump right up to April of this year, the General Assembly is clearly itself very frustrated by what's happening with the Security Council. And first, and to be fair to the Security Council, it was the Security Council that when the Ukrainian invasion aggression was not being addressed because of the use of the veto, the Security Council called an emergency session of the General Assembly, and the General Assembly adopted a very strong resolution condemning the aggression in Ukraine. But since then, in April of this year, the General Assembly has adopted a further resolution without a vote, essentially saying that whenever the veto is used, the President of the General Assembly may within 10 days call a session of the General Assembly for discussion of the use of that veto. And it goes on to say as well that the state that has exercised the veto should be given the first to speak to the General Assembly and debate. So essentially what the General Assembly has said is the veto is not just a matter for the Security Council. The veto affects all states. It affects international peace and security. And that use of the veto should not be without explanation. And so what it's doing is demanding an explanation from the state that has vetoed as to why that veto has been made. And this is a step towards greater multilateralism. It is a step towards greater accountability, greater transparency as to what is going on within the Security Council and its debate. What it doesn't go on to say is what is the effect. And I think there are sort of two weaknesses. One is this only operates when a veto has been used. And of course, it's a very powerful tool for the Permanent Five to threaten to use the veto. Threat of the use of veto may well be used to weaken the language of a resolution, for example, or even to stop a resolution being put at all. And in that case, on the wording of the resolution, the General Assembly doesn't have the power that it's now taken to itself. The second is what follows. Does the General Assembly have a vote as to whether that was an appropriate use of the veto? If so, then what? The General Assembly has only got recommendatory powers. Presumably it is resting on some notion of naming and shaming, public pressure, international community pressure. It might work, I suppose, that the resolution would go back to the Security Council and not be vetoed because of the General Assemblies, but the General Assembly cannot avoid, avoid the veto as such. So yes, it is a measure, and yes, it does suggest that the General Assembly can do some things. The General Assembly has, for example, acted to expel Russia from the Human Rights Council, the Human Rights Council being a subsidiary of the General Assembly. And I think another point, just go back to the Security Council, is that there's a general failure within the United Nations overall to join the various dots of all these different organs. We've had organs of the United Nations that have acted. So the Human Rights Council, through the General Assembly, has expelled Russia. The ICC, the International Criminal Court, has commenced investigations. There are things happening, but they're not joined up in any way. And I think that that is another aspect that could be looked at. But I should stop there. That's a
No, 'cause
fairly
I think
long
there's
reply.
I think there's a really interesting point there, because it looks as if there are ways in which it could be made to work if those dots were joined. And we have the ICJ decision
Yeah.
already. And what role could that have had in informing the General Assembly in what they could demand of the Security Council, for example? And
yes,
I mean,
and sorry, just to jump in again, in earlier opinions of the International Court of Justice, the court has made recommendations, and of course the court's recommendations carry with it the weight of the principal judicial body of the United Nations. So yeah, them saying to the Security Council, you can do this, would have more weight than our letter, I think.
Surely not. We're the people parts. Oksana, you said you had many more points you want to make, and I think on the back of that you can see this. Well, you already know the obstacles there are by trying to get some sort of multilateralism involved here, apart from the individual states going and whatever.
I mean, I will keep my argument to decolonize UN as a cross-cutting one. And the other one I want to bring up is, yes, the webinar that we are uniting under today is called, Can the UN Save Ukraine and Save Itself? So I keep in mind that while we talk about these long-term solutions and we remind each other that they take time, for me as a Ukrainian and for all of us, it's still a matter of urgency to do whatever the international community can to stop this war. And of course, highlighting the injustices and the human rights violations that have already been committed and keeping those who are responsible to account, I think is a very important instrument. And again, I want to remind you that this hasn't started in February 2022, as a lot of the international community seems to think. And I think that due to impunity and lack of accountability to Russia's actions in 2014, such as annexation of Crimea and involvement of itself in supporting the rebel troops in Donbass and not recognizing its role in the conflict in Donbass since 2014, which has also laid the ground for expectations of further impunity with further actions. So I think whatever can be done now with existing mechanisms within the UN to, as Christine rightly pointed out, to document human rights violations as much as possible, being on the ground, and I stress partnering with the local civil society organizations, which is more than capable. I'm not sure if you're aware, but director of La Strada organization, Katerina Cherepacha, spoke to the UN Security Council in April this year, about the work that they have been doing with survivors of sexual violence. This was already after Bucha and other towns have been liberated, and we started to see the immensity of these atrocities. So partnering with local civil society and women's groups to document, properly record, and to ensure investigation and accountability for these crimes could be a really effective mechanisms of further prevention. And not only for Russia, I hope it's also clear that while we are talking about a specific war, it sets a tone for other possible invaders and empires that use militarization to expand their borders and their powers. And I think that's our ultimate feminist project that we keep in mind. And there was one other thing that I had in my head and it's escaping me now, but basically it's about starting to work on accountability mechanisms now. Yes, another important reason for that is because OSCE, another multilateral organization, which Russia is a member of, which is consensus-based, has failed to reinstate its special monitoring mission in Ukraine as of April this year due to lack of support from all of its members. You can guess who blocked that decision. And with all the questions and we had to the SMM mission in Ukraine over the last years, it was an important mechanism of monitoring and documentation of ceasefire violations and other human rights violations in the east of Ukraine for the last 8 years. And that mechanism is also gone now, because of another institution is failing in its own implementation. And this brings even more the urgency and the importance of doing this work now, doing it in parallel. And I think the sooner we start investigations on some of those crimes, the sooner we begin the justice process, the more of a message it will send to Russia itself and to the global community that this cannot wait, this should not wait. This may in fact be one of the tools of prevention of further escalation, because we also know, and this comes as testimony from human rights activists inside and outside Ukraine who are in touch with people in the occupied territories, is that the cities and the regions that Russia takes over inside Ukraine are full of kidnappings, violations, rapes, abductions of people based on their political activity, based on their belonging to activist community, LGBT community, women's rights activists. And a lot of those cases remain undocumented as well for lack of methodology, but also just lack of basic security of people who would, want to try to pass that information across. Kherson, for example, is one of those cities that is rarely on the map right now. We talk a lot about Mariupol, which is obviously important, but because Kherson hasn't been so actively shelled, it doesn't mean it's peaceful. It's from that. So just yesterday, I attended an event here in Berlin where an organization that escaped Kherson and still in touch with a lot of activists, queer feminist activists there, keeps bringing attention to the violations in this city, including, political activism, but also socioeconomic foundation of security, lack of basic access to food and water, and lack of access to cash. And all of those things are happening at the same time. So the further we extend and allow Russia to continue extending its in its territories, the further we exacerbate both human rights and humanitarian crisis. And again, I think accountability and bringing that to attention of the global community is key right now, not later, not after, but at the same time.
That's so important, Dr. And I think there's so many things in what you've just said. I mean, one being, I am looking forward to the one we look at the economics of it because of what you said about Crimea and nobody doing anything. Why not? I think that's a very critical element of it all. But also the idea of having, there must be accountability for all of this. Now we do have, the ICC has already started its own investigations and the invitation of Ukraine, and we now have the Human Rights Authorized Commission of Inquiry. And I think this is something that Christine, you and I have been talking about for years and years and years, is the application of social, cultural, economic rights in conflict, because nobody pays attention. And it's what you've just outlined as being critically important. And there's huge gender dimensions to all of that. And yet we look at the terrible violations of IHL, international criminal law more broadly, how that has got to be prosecuted.
Just
do you want to comment on that?
Yeah, small fact, just finish that idea, which really startled me yesterday, is that as of now, and again, I wouldn't be able to tell you numbers, but according to people in Kherson, more people have died from lack of access to insulin in Kherson than from shellings and shootings. I mean, that should tell you the severity of other dimensions of this crisis, and that how important human security lens is at every stage of war, which is again what feminists bring to this conversation.
Yeah, absolutely, so important. Christine, you're muted.
Sorry, as I say, that is just so what you've just said, Oksana, all the way through is so important. But that is so often the case in so many situations of conflict where more deaths occur through the sort of indirect, the lack of clean water, the collapse of the sanitation system, and the lack of medicines, as you have just said, than of the immediate direct. And which is why also it is so important that gender-based crimes are understood not just as a sexual violence, but these much broader understandings of gender-based harms.
And that's something that we're hoping the ICC will address, because if they're really examining gender persecution, then we need to be factoring all these things that have been done, which have actually destroyed the infrastructure, which enable rights to be actually enjoyed. Sorry, Louise, I cut you off.
No, that's okay, because that's precisely what I was going to say, but you said it more eloquently. There you go.
Just to say,
But can I just add yet another sort of part? Again,
No.
building on what Oksana has just said, she mentioned kidnapping. The Security Council, in another series of resolutions, has talked about trafficking, but it has limited it to trafficking by sort of so-called extremist groups, or what they recognize as terrorists. The vulnerability to trafficking of so many displaced people, especially again women and children, is absolutely enormous, and again something that needs to be brought into this wider picture.
Yeah, totally important. I realize
I am going to jump in here, because the irony here is it is not necessary. Okay, so the issue of trafficking is now global. Okay, it may start in Ukraine, but the vulnerabilities as people move, and there are displaced amongst the displaced communities. Yes, there are more risk within Ukraine, but it is also when they cross the border, and perhaps because they cross the border, because we're not looking. And this is why it is absolutely critical that those states, not only neighboring states surrounding any conflict zone, but further afield, ensure that they have policies in place so that they can facilitate the safe movement of people who are fleeing conflict zones. And this is where, I'm sorry, I'm making it a little bit political here, where this government in particular has been sorely lacking. And we are an example of how not to do things. And it is absolutely awful that this is happening.
Just in case anyone missed it, that would be the United Kingdom. I've been very bad here because we're supposed to open this for Q&As now, and there are some questions in the chat which I have not been paying attention to, because Agnieszka, I hope, was paying attention to them. Agnieszka, is there anything that you would surface that can be addressed?
Yeah, thanks, Madeline, and thank you all for the great discussion. I think, you really struck the chord with the discussion around the Security Council reform and what would work, right? So I think a lot of the questions are coming in around this. There is a question from Maribeth Gardam about the veto, and, would it be possible to remove it, right? Is that even a possibility? But I think perhaps more broadly, there's a couple others, and a question from Leslie coming in, which I think really addresses, it kind of summarizes those really well, is you all touched on this, right? But what would be your vision, right? You mentioned the greater balance of power between the Security Council and the UNGA, but what beyond that, either within the UN or in an alternative institution, right? What would make for an institution that's more fit for purpose? That's coming from Leslie, and I think it captures a few things, and Christine and Louise, you both touched on that, as well as Oksana. So I feel like that's a question to everyone equally, but Madeline, you'll decide. Two more questions to highlight. One is on the problems posed by the conduct of Security Council permanent members. So again, speaking to your point, Oksana, on accountability, for example, in Libya. So Madeline, I don't know if you have something to say to that from WILPF's work in Libya too. And then finally, an interesting question taking us maybe kind of to a broader picture from zooming in on Ukraine, right? The question being, if the UN holds Russia accountable now, right? We all hope that will happen. We're all pushing for that. We all hope this will be a beginning of a new kind of era for the international system. What are the implications for holding other major powers accountable for what they've done? They would likely fight equally hard as Russia to evade such accountability. What would the better international system, better Security Council look like to you? How to address the problems posed by the conduct of security members elsewhere, for example, in Libya? And if Security Council holds Russia accountable, what are the implications for other great powers?
Who wants to have a go at that little check?
Okay, I'm ready to jump in.
Go on. Well,
and make a
go for it, Louise.
complete fool of myself. But okay, so I'm quite interested in rethinking how one might restructure the balance of power within the international multilateral system. And I want to raise the question as to why we still have permanent seats. Okay, why not have a rotation system that is forever rotating? Okay, because I want to then turn the question back to the P5 themselves and for them to justify why they are entitled to the permanent seat. I don't think it's up to us to try and undermine or to elaborate on why they may not be entitled. Okay, I think in 2022, they need to be able to justify why they are. And I think that's going to be pretty difficult to do. So that was my one sort of slightly wild idea.
No, that's a start. That's a start. Christine.
I was just thinking that when the UN itself was created, it took, I suppose one point is it was created during the war, during the Second World War. And it is clearly that when there is war of that sort is the moment for innovative thinking. So this surely should be when, you know, people are, as we are trying to do so. Perhaps one suggestion would be, why don't we start, I think Roxana has actually mentioned this already, why do we focus on international peace and security in this militarized sense? Why don't we come back to human security and say that this is an organization that should be looking primarily at human security? And if we were looking at human security, then we've already mentioned social and economic rights, but other values would have to be given higher in the hierarchy of what was being protected. And so again, maybe we're just asking the wrong question in focusing so strongly on international peace and security, which by definition is going to be so often interstate and involving sovereignty, territorial claims, etc., rather than looking at the security of persons across areas.
And can I just add on that one, the adoption that we have now as WILPF is that basically you've got to look up, because, you know, the threat overall is that to the environment. And the more wars we fight, the less attention we pay to that. Surely the Security Council, I know it won't do it because of the veto. If they paid attention to pulling together to actually address that, maybe we would have some hope of doing it. I mean, the war in Ukraine is just the latest, which is shutting that window that we have been told that we had to stop.
It's not just shutting the window, it's creating a huge amount of further environmental degradation.
Well, it's over.
One of the biggest polluters, the military, more generally.
Abolish the military, we won't have to worry too much about recycling. Flippantly. Anyway,
recycle the military.
I, as a Ukraine who is right now advocate to Ukraine, I must come out feminist anti-militarist community about my position. Hello?
No, we can't hear you very well, Oksana. We're losing you a bit. Try. Can you start again?
I said as anti-militarist from has been months. I think we are just abandoning arms. I was dreaming of that in the first week of the war, thinking to myself, maybe finally the world will wake up to the danger of arms. And, after we end this violence, within a week was my hope, we will just say, okay, everyone, just put down your toys and put them away, and we're already seeing that this is not going to happen. There is a question in the chat about Sweden and Finland joining NATO. And I think here we forget about positionality and embodiment, also as part of decision-making and knowledge-making. And I'm reminded of another situation that happened to me at CSW in 2019 when I was in New York. And during discussion with the Secretary General, one of the participants raised her hand and said, what can we do about the fact that some of the members of my organization from, I unfortunately remember a country in Africa that she came from, didn't get there to attend CSW today. So they would want to be here at the UN Assembly and they cannot for legal restrictions and visa regulations for the fact that the UN office is in New York. And then she said, perhaps we can propose as feminists that instead of convening a table in New York, bring that table to our countries. And I think part of that needs to be part of our thinking as well. How UN decision making going to change when some of its offices are located in countries that are suffering the most from environmental disasters, from wars, and this is in fact one of the things that President Zelensky suggested. And I never thought I would be quoting my president in fora like this, but in his address to the UN General Assembly early April, he suggested that Ukraine is willing to become a place for one of the new offices of the UN for prevention of security threats. And that was, I think, his kind of imaginary of decentralizing the UN and also decentralizing its locations, because I think it matters, the geography and the physicality and geopolitics making matters, and we cannot deny right now it's again heavily centralized in the global north and in Europe. And it does touch upon as well the issue of food security that you mentioned very briefly, which again I think deserves a larger discussion, which will cause increased migration flow, probably to Europe, but also among between states that are affected in North Africa. And the question that I keep asking myself is, we already have this information that can be feedback to the EU, to the UN, that this is happening, it's going to happen. You will see displaced people at your door in a few months from now. But that's not feedback enough somehow still. So until those people are physically at the border, is that not a threat enough? The question is, how do we improve our system of feedback? What is feedback enough to start acting? Someone suggested in the chat that the countries that make decisions need to feel the economic impacts on their own states and on their own pockets, and that's going to be feedback enough. Maybe it is back to our bodies, back to such really visible things that we need in order to share risks. I don't know. That's the question I keep asking myself.
There are so many questions. I think unfortunately we've only got like 3 minutes left, but wouldn't it be wonderful if all these brilliant ideas that flow from activists on the ground, through legal interpretation, obligations which flow from that, through institutions, could all be brought together so that there could be discussion of the various elements that need to be addressed when there is conflict and how to actually stop those conflicts and actually address not just root causes, but long-term consequences of those root causes if not addressed in the way that international law demands. We actually have that institution. It's just not working. And I think this goes back to the question that we have asked all the time. Member states ostensibly represent we the people, but they don't. They don't at home and they don't in the fora of the United Nations. They actually represent the next WILPF seminar, which is to be on, look at the globalization of international conflict, which is both financed and weaponized by the P5 in particular, but not exclusively. And a lot of it's individual as well. We cannot obviously ignore the rise of oligarchs who have pillaged Russia, but completely, to the impoverishment of the ordinary people of Russia, which is, to be abhorred. So we have all of these different things which have gone in the wrong direction, but completely since WILPF started talking about these things in 1915. And I think it's now time we have a fundamental reappraisal of where power lies. Your point completely, Oksana, that there's too much power in the very few states which control how the UN works. And Ray Atchison's on this call, and she was so instrumental in getting a ban on nuclear weapons. But the pressure that was brought by the P5 on states that wanted to enter into a rational discourse on the consequences, costs of nuclear weapons was enormous. And though that is what we're up against, it's a geopolitical interest, not the we the people interests. And this is what we've got to find ways of overcoming. Now, in closing, I would like to just pass it on to you for a last word, if you can, and to thank you enormously for the incredible contributions you've made so far. We obviously have to have a continuation of this discussion. Christine, can I hit on you first to reflect with your microphone on?
I have an extremely noisy cat that I've been trying to drown out by pushing the mute button on the whole time. I'm going to say 3 words: double standards and patriarchy. That's it.
Louise.
Oh my God, she's chosen the only one word that I want to use, patriarchy. But you know, but yeah, patriarchy and capitalism. There you go.
There you go. Oksana, your go. Are you frozen? Oh.
will say the phrase that, yes, I used speaking to peace activists a few months ago. I think the body is our enemy, not a particular state or a particular person. And I keep seeing how in our analysis of the situation it's produced, and it's the basis of power relations and it's the basis of violence. There's the powerful and the powerful, and there's only 2 sides. There's only 2 solutions. And I think feminist imagination we need to allow ourselves to think about plurality of solutions when it's not either or. We either give up completely arms and we focus on, we only do military and then we forget about human. It's probably going to be both and something else. And I think I'm inviting myself, even in this traumatic, complex time, to think about this both and solution, which I hope will lead us away from neocolonial thinking, from racist thinking, from patriarchal heteronormative thinking. So my invitation is in a way to queer and to decolonize the global security infrastructure. You know, let's be.
Totally love that. Totally love that. End the binary, smash the patriarchy, and then we don't have to have the discussions about vetoes because they will no longer be necessary or possible. Listen, thank you so much, everyone. I've really enjoyed it. I hope people who were trying to get questions in the chat will join us next time. We'll be putting out information as to, we're going to do a series of different webinars in this sort of format to chat about what's really happening with brilliant experts who can actually tell us what's happening. And to try and find solutions, which is obviously the direction of travel that everyone in the chat has been desperately searching for, as are we all. But the wonderful thing is, I do think our analysis is right. And I think we also see the consequences when our analysis is not used. And I say that analysis as feminists and as people who believe in peace and the possibilities of peace. So on that note, I hope we will be putting out when and what the webinars will be. So please look out for those. We'll make sure they are circulated well. And thanks again to everybody for joining.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. It's been an honor.
Thank you. Yeah.